You're listening to Bare Necessities, the world's best podcast about the Coventry Bears. This week we present our first off-season bonus episode, and what a special one it is. Joining us on the show is the BBC's voice of rugby league, Dave Woods. We talk about Dave's career, about expansion, and of course about how the greatest game might grow in Coventry. So settle in, because here we go. Well, I'm very, very pleased to welcome to the show this week a very special guest, the BBC's rugby league correspondent and voice of the game for many of you. It's Dave Woods. Dave, welcome to Bare Necessities podcast. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. That's very kind of you. Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks. It's nice to be invited as well, so thank you.
Well, let's say I really appreciate you taking the time to chat to me for this week's show. I guess where I wanted to start was to get an idea of what your view is of League One and of expansion as a whole, not only from the point of view in your role as a journalist, but also as someone who's a fan of the game and has grown up in the heartlands, really.
Yeah. I think I've always been an I have always been an expansionist. I always wanted to see more teams developing out with the heartlands. And I think to a certain extent, League One is quite an exciting seeding ground, to see some clubs come through. And I've been very lucky this last year, obviously covering one or two of the Toronto games over here to actually get to, not to Coventry, unfortunately, but got to London Scholars, got to Newcastle, and got to Wales as well. So, it's exciting. It's great going to those places and realising just how many real enthusiasts, real fanatics for the game are there, who are trying to promote the game. Mm-hmm. Which is fantastic. But I think at the same time we have to be careful in that we don't kind of overstretch and end up with clubs who you wonder why they're there. I think Hemel Hempstead is the one that falls into that category at the moment, where it's a club that's based up in Yorkshire. I think they're training Dewsbury, and there was a story recently of them playing, I don't know whether it's Keighley or Hunslet, but they a couple of coaches came down from Yorkshire, match was played, they got back on the coaches and went back north again. I don't think that's good enough in terms of having a club there and calling them by that local name when they're only there in name only. So I think clubs and I get the impression that Coventry is very much like a Newcastle, like a London Scholars, that there's a lot of really good work going on in terms of, introducing people who might not know about rugby league to rugby league and try to grow the game at that level. And I think that's really important, and that is to be applauded and is terrific.
It's interesting that you say that about Coventry, because I obviously wanted to ask you about Coventry and really try and get an idea of whether the Bears are a club that's name gets mentioned much where you are on a weekly basis, because I know obviously Toronto is the sexy option for League One this season. But what about Coventry?
I don't think it gets mentioned that much, and I don't know whether this makes people at Coventry bridle, but when it does, it kind of gets mentioned in the context of Wasps. Mm-hmm. The idea being that if a Super League club was to emerge, then it's probably via Wasps and the Ricoh Arena. And we did a piece on the podcast earlier this year where we talked to Wasps, and I think the guy we spoke to is no longer there. But there seemed to be a kind of a distant idea. I wouldn't even call it an aspiration. A distant idea that maybe one day they might be interested in setting up a Super League club or taking Coventry under their wing. The current Coventry, your team, under the wing a little bit more and promoting that. So, but other than that, I don't think it really gets a lot of mention. And that's probably a kind of a myopic view from the heartlands. Mm-hmm. Again, to my shame, when I go on travels to places that I mentioned before, it's only then that you actually realise the amount of enthusiasm that goes on, and that doesn't get flagged up probably that much in Lancashire and Yorkshire, and that's probably a great shame. It probably could do with a lot more people being a lot more aware of a lot of the good work that is going on in places like Coventry and elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you ever fancy a visit to Coventry next season,
I'd love to.
Welcome to come down. There's lots of good stuff going on.
Yeah,
I was interested as well as to what route you would rather see a club take. So we've again pulling on Toronto as an example this year. They've obviously got strong financial backing. They're getting big players in, and they're going for it. They're aiming for Super League as quickly as possible. Whereas clubs like the Bears and Newcastle and some of the Welsh clubs are trying to build that community base and perhaps taking the more scenic route, shall we put it? Do you have a preference as to either of those approaches, or?
I think if a club could grow, I mean, I think Toronto has to go the way it has to go in terms of building like that, in terms of, throw big money at it. I think the problem with the seeded route, establish a club at Coventry and then let's see where it goes. I think you kind of hit a dead end. There's going to be a certain point where you potentially hit a dead end. I think it has to be a combination of the two. I think what Toronto seem to have is a financial backer who is in it for the long term. And I think that if you are going to have a financial backer, then that's what you need. I mean, look at Salford at the moment. They're in all kinds of shtuck because their financial backer has said no more and has walked away from the club. And, the immediate and medium-term future and long-term future of that club is a little more clouded than it was 12 months ago. But if you start with a Coventry or a Newcastle or a South Wales in the way that you do, or a London Scholars for that matter, in the way that has been started, I think that's fantastic because you kind of gauge an interest, you gather in, you start the rolling momentum, don't you? But I think at some point there has to be a financial injection to actually take it to the next level. A club like Castleford survives in Super League. Well, it has survived in Super League because of the financial backing it has got in the past, but survives now in Super League because of the money it gets from the TV deals, because of the crowd it generates, etc., etc. It's very hard to replicate that. Well, it's impossible to replicate that in League One because you're not generating a lot of self-determined income, are you? It's not like you're getting a massive payout from the RFL. I think it's only 70,000 in League One. It's not like you're generating big crowds, so that finances the move forward. I think it's fantastic and very important that you put down roots and real sturdy roots. But I think at some point it probably does need someone with financial clout and longevity to come in and say, right, I'm going to finance this.
Yeah, I think I would certainly agree. So Dave, I couldn't get you on the podcast and not talk a bit about you and about your career in rugby league. So how did you get into the sport, and what are your memories of rugby league from growing up?
I have no memories of my life without rugby league being there because I was kind of, my dad was a big rugby league fan. So when I came along, apparently I was taken to my first game when I was 2 years old, and I can't remember that. So it's always, I was actually brought up as a Wigan fan. My dad was a Wigan rugby league fan. It's a bit of a weird one really, because half my family are from Wigan. My mum's side of the family are from Wigan, and none of them are interested in rugby league. Whereas my dad's side of the family are all from Bolton. It's only 12 miles down the road, but rugby league's a foreign language, But my dad actually fell into rugby league when he was a teenager, went watching Lee and then started watching Wigan in the days of Billy Boston, etc. So when I came along, I was very much holding his hand, going to matches, and loving it, absolutely loving it. So I grew up with a Wigan team in the early 70s that wasn't that great. So it wasn't like kind of a glory edition. It was a proper growing up into a hard-time rugby league club. And of course, early 80s actually got relegated into what was the second division. So that was, and kind of lost the passion for Wigan. One, because professionally, I started working at Radio Leeds in the early 90s, 1990 in fact, at the time when Wigan were at their pomp. So kind of started losing the passion for Wigan because they were winning everything, and it was getting a bit boring. But also because I was working at Radio Leeds and covering rugby league at Radio Leeds, I was, working at covering Leeds rugby and Bradford Northern as was, and Wakefield Trinity and Castleford and Huddersfield and Halifax and all those clubs. And because of that, you kind of grow a fondness for all those different clubs. So you wanted to see them win a lot more as well. So that kind of hard-edged passion, fanaticism for Wigan was worn off. And now, it's, if I'm watching them, it's just like watching another club. I have literally no great passion to see Wigan win games. It's just a desire to see a good game of rugby league, whoever's playing these days.
Yeah. And in terms of getting into commentary, because most people listening to this podcast will recognise your voice as a commentator. So you mentioned you started work on Radio Leeds in 1990. Was that always a career option that interested you?
No, it wasn't actually. I read a book when I was 16. In English, it's classic tale of an English teacher giving you a book and it changes your life. He gave me a book called There Is a Happy Land by an author called Keith Waterhouse when I was 16. And I had no idea at that stage what I wanted to do. And he gave me this book, and I read this book, and I thought it was an absolutely fantastic book. And then I read another book by Keith Waterhouse, which is slightly more famous, which is called Billy Liar, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners would have heard of. And just became obsessed. You know, when you're 16, obsessions, you know, you're with a rock group or a football club or a rugby club or whatever. Mm-hmm. And mine was with Keith Waterhouse. And I decided I wanted to be whatever Keith Waterhouse was. And it turned out he was a journalist for the Daily Mirror. So that was my ambition. So from that point on, I decided I was going to be a journalist. And I contacted my local paper, Bolton Evening News as was, and said, you don't do a lot of rugby league, I'll do it for you, you know, with that kind of cockiness that teenage brings, and the sports editor there was actually very good, and well, from my point of view, and he let me do a little bit of stuff for the Bolton Evening News. So that kind of made my enthusiasm to be a journalist even greater. And I covered the first game of rugby league I ever covered was a Regal Trophy game, Leeds against Wigan, and I would have thought 1984. I was still at school. And I covered it and did the match report for the Bolton Evening News, and that was that. You know, I just wanted to be a newspaper writer. Mm-hmm. And when I left school, the day after I'd finished my A-levels, I started working for an agency, a freelance agency, who were based in Wigan, and they covered rugby league and football, but they did a lot of news as well. And I have no interest in radio, but we used to do Preston North End, Wigan Athletic, and Wigan Rugby League, and we used to cover those teams for any newspaper. Radio station who weren't at the game. You know, they'd engage us as freelancers to cover those matches. And one particular week, the boss of the agency died very suddenly, very tragically died. But we still had a load of games to do the following weekend. And the new boss said to me, it's not a question of whether you want to do radio, because I know you don't, but you're going to have to do radio this week because it's all hands to the pump. Mm-hmm. So I ended up covering Preston North End against Swansea for Radio Wales. Absolutely terrified, frightened to death, nervous as anything. Did the match, and at the end of it, you know, just felt on an adrenaline rush because I'd got through this terrible fear of doing it. And they said, right, you'll be doing that every week. And I ended up doing just little match reports, you know, inserts into programs for various radio stations around the country. Mm-hmm. And every Wednesday, I'd find out which match I was doing or who I was doing it for, and it would ruin my week because I was just so terrified of being on the radio, absolutely shockingly terrified of being on the radio, but had to do it. And slowly, over a couple of years, it was a long time. It was a reign of terror that lasted a while. But over a couple of years, I got more used to it and began to enjoy it. And in the end, thought, actually, radio is for me. So I applied for a job at Radio Leeds in 1990 and got that. I went across there as a news journalist at Radio Leeds, but because of my love for rugby league, you know, very quickly ended up on the rugby league team as well, and it kind of all developed from there, really.
So if you were nervous about being on the radio at the start of your career, fast forward a few years where you have the, from an outsider, potentially unenviable task of taking over from Ray French on the BBC.
Yeah.
What was that? What was that like?
Well, that was incredible because French is a big hero of mine, and he, you know, absolutely fantastic. And also the idea of commentating on a Challenge Cup final at Wembley was just wow. You know, for me, as growing up as a kid, I never saw a lot of the matches at Wembley because I've been to every Wembley since '74, so I never actually watched them. But I knew that this was an iconic, you know, this iconic thing. It was Eddie Waring from the 1950s till 1980. It was Frenchy from 1980 till 2008. And then when I took over in 2009 from Frenchy, that was just, I mean, that cup final was just, for me, a career highlight. Sitting there at Wembley, commentating on the Challenge Cup final, which for me today, even now, is still the biggest event of the year, the Challenge Cup final. But taking over from a bloke who was as loved as Ray was, and who is just a champion bloke. You know, I still see him 2-3 times a week. And he's just one of my favourite people because he's just a lovely, lovely fella who's absolutely steeped in rugby league. And he gave me a lot of great advice about, you know, taking over the job, which I look back on even now and think, yeah, we should be doing that because Frenchie says that's the way it should be done. Mm-hmm. So it was a big step. It was a big step, but he was very supportive, and he made it a lot easier.
Great. And in terms of, if I asked you to pick a favourite game you've commentated on and your best and worst people to interview, who would they be?
Right, favourite game. Well, you tend to go for the ones that are freshest in the memories, and I have to say Castleford against St Helens the other night was pretty special. Yeah. I mean, I was only doing it for highlights, but that was wow, that was fantastic. It was funny because I was chatting to my dad, who's 80 now, chatting to my dad the day after, and he's been watching rugby league most of all his adult life and a bit beyond, and he reckoned that was one of his best games, watching the game. So that takes some beating. But looking back down the years, actually working on November the 4th, 2006, the Great Britain's victory over Australia in Sydney, that was pretty special. That was actually my 40th birthday, which gives my age away. So it was a great way to spend your 40th birthday commentating on that game. That was pretty good. I think the £1 million game last year was excellent. There was a Challenge Cup semi-final, St Helens against Leeds a few years ago. I think it was 2005. I might have got that wrong, but Huddersfield, when Danny Maguire, in fact, probably earlier than that because Danny Maguire was fresh off the block, but he scored in the corner to take it to extra time. Kevin Sinfield kicked a goal off the touchline. That was pretty special. What else stands out down the years? As a spectator, Wigan 28, Hull 24, the 1985 Challenge Cup final was pretty good. The Sheffield final, 98, when they beat Wigan, was extra special because John Keir is a good friend of mine and was then a very good friend of mine, and he was coach of Sheffield that day, and all the wow factor of that. So there's been loads of fantastic games, and there's probably 106 that are left out, Yeah. So those are the great games. Easy to interview. I'd always put Cameron Smith at the top of my list. Yeah. Fantastic player, just an ultimate professional, just a dream. Great to sit down and speak with. But, we do our own podcast on the Beeb, and I've had the great pleasure of sitting down with some people this year and chatting to. And Tim Sheens at Old Kingston Rovers these days, he was great. Difficult people to interview. Well, I've interviewed Wayne Bennett a few times, and he has that reputation to be very difficult. And I've had kind of mixed experiences. One was great. I sat down and did a TV interview with him before the Samoa Test match this year, and fantastic. You felt like I could have sat there all day. But then the first time I interviewed him was a lot more difficult, not because you felt intimidated by him in any way, but just that he didn't seem, he just gave you one-word answers. And yourself doing interviews, it's if you're only getting one-word answers, it makes it very difficult.
It certainly does.
But I think the standout, most difficult person to interview is Brian McDermott, because he challenges you. You're never quite sure what you're going to get from him. You're never quite sure how he's going to respond. You can ask the same question twice, and he'll give you completely different manner of response. So I would say that Brian McDermott at the moment is the most difficult person to interview, but then that becomes fun because it is a challenge, and you've got to really think about what questions you're asking and how you pose those questions when you're chatting with him.
Fair enough. Hey, sorry to interrupt what I hope you think is a great listen, but I just have a quick request. Now, Craig and I have loved doing this podcast, and we will definitely be back next season regardless. In fact, we'd actually like to up our game next year and, make an official website for the podcast and give ourselves a proper home online. The thing is, web hosting, domain names and all of that sort of thing, that costs money. So in a properly British awkward manner, we would like to put out a call for sponsors. So if you or anyone you know would be interested in helping out this show and becoming one of our very first sponsors for 2018, then we would love to hear from you. If that sounds interesting, please send us an email to covbearspodcast@gmail.com and we'll get in touch with details about what we're looking for and what you'll get in return. So that's covbearspodcast@gmail.com. We should stress that we're not looking for much, but it all helps, and it will just help us make sure the show is as good as it can possibly be. Okay, thanks for that. Sorry about that as well. Anyway, now back to the podcast. So we're at the business end of the season now, and obviously we're 3 years into this revised structure with the whole Super 8's qualifiers £1 million game, and we've just seen what happened last weekend. From your point of view, do you think this is a structure that's working? Because rugby league is a game that changes its mind so often. What do you make of the whole Super 8's qualifiers thing?
I think. Well, since I've been watching the game, there've been so many different structures. You know, one division with everyone in, with a playoff championship at the end. Two divisions with 4 up, 4 down, 2 up, 2 down, 1 up, 1 down. The Hetherington plan, when I think we had 12, 8 and 16 in 3 different leagues. We've had franchising. We've had, Super League that allowed promotion, Super League that didn't allow promotion, the closed shop. We've got the Super 8. The honest answer is that rugby league, there's no perfect solution. There's absolutely no perfect solution. Nobody will ever come up with a situation and say that fits everybody. Everybody can be happy with this, because you've got 4 or 5 big clubs who want the game run one way. You've got another 6, 7 or 8 clubs who want the game run another way. You've then got, your championship clubs who want a chance of getting up, your League One clubs who want to get up. So there's no structure that would fit everybody, because the funding isn't quite there to keep everybody happy under one perfect structure. I think this system has got, it's got its benefits. This year we've seen some fascinating top 8 games. We've seen some compulsive middle 8 games. Whether the £1 million game is as it should be, if you're going to have promotion and relegation, you've got to have jeopardy in some respect, and you've got to have a club getting relegated. Whether that's through a £1 million game as it stands, I'm not sure, because under the current system, you could have Warrington finishing 9th and Halifax finishing 4th in the championship, and they both start that middle 8th in exactly the same situation. If Warrington suddenly pick up 4 or 5 different injuries, they're in danger of going down. Do we want a Warrington or a Leeds last year to be relegated? What doesn't that take a lot away from the Super League? So I think there are a lot of flaws in the system, but I think you can develop any system and say, oh, well, that's wrong and that's wrong and that's wrong. I think we need to kind of evolve what we've got at the minute, and I think there will be an evolution of what we've got. But we'll be having this debate 4 years' time. I think in 4 years' time we'll be saying, well, let's go back to 12s, 8s, and 8s. It's just people now are saying licensing wasn't working. 3 years ago, people saying licensing wasn't working. People are now saying let's go back to licensing. So there'll never be a perfect system, but enjoy what we've got, and what we've got has produced 2 absolutely magnificent semi-finals. That's led to what's hopefully going to be a great grand final. It's given us £3 million games to remember, even if the quality of the sport wasn't great. It's caused a stir. It grabs eyeballs out with rugby league. It's the £1 million game at least is a game that people who don't necessarily follow rugby league, at least they're having a look at it. The value of the competitions below that, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to go back a bit to talking about, obviously, Coventry and the Midlands. And obviously the Midlands is more traditionally a rugby union stronghold, but with the Bears establishing some footholds in the area, and that, it feels like, from my point of view as a Midlander, it feels like the Midlands is a massive untapped resource. And I know the Bears have set up a project with the Midlands Hurricanes, which Castleford are involved with as well, to try and start creating a pathway for local players to come through. Do you see that as a potential untapped resource in terms of the Midlands for rugby league?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's an absolutely vital area that rugby league has to get into, whether it's the Midlands, whether it's the southeast and the southwest, wherever. I think rugby league has a very limited gene pool at the moment, and that gene pool is getting smaller. Wigan and Hull and Castleford are probably the 3 towns, cities, whatever, that produce rugby league players. And over the years, and those areas are not producing as many as they did, because the schools are not playing and 1 or 2 amateur teams are closing down. So I think the sport has to look as far and as wide as possible, because there are potential rugby league players and potential superstar rugby league players in every town in the country. The only reason we don't unearth them is because they've never been given a chance to play rugby league. So if you've got a project in the Midlands that is saying, right, come on kids, have a go at this, then that's when we find players. I mean, you look at the grand final this weekend, Mike McMeekan, for example, who could very well be playing for England in the World Cup this year, played in the mid-season international in Samoa. Had London not existed, had London Broncos not existed, wouldn't be involved. Tony Clubb is another example. You know, McCarthy Scarsbrook is another example of players who, had they not been given that chance, we would never have seen them, and they're very good players. So the game has to look in every single pocket of the land to see what talent is out there and give kids a chance of playing the game. Because, you know, kids who are drawn to rugby union might not make it in rugby union for whatever reason, but could actually be terrifically suited to rugby league. Regan Grace is another example of this. You know, a kid who was playing rugby union in South Wales, looking for something to do in the summer, hooked up with his local rugby league club, fell in love with the sport, and has become potentially a rugby league superstar. So there's going to be hundreds, probably thousands of those kids in the Midlands, and we have to give them, as a sport, we have to give them the opportunity to be found by the sport. So that's hats off to what's happening there.
And I suppose another side of that getting the sport in front of young people are marquee events such as the international doubleheader that the Ricoh Arena hosted last November, and that showed a big interest in the area. I know a large proportion of the tickets sold were from the surrounding area. And I know when in your podcast earlier in the year, when you were talking about the Coventry question, and there was talk about having a Magic weekend in Coventry, if that were to happen, and perhaps see Coventry host some World Cup matches in 2021, how crucial do you think that could be?
Well, I think it's pretty certain that it will host matches in 2021. Whether the Magic weekend will go there remains to be seen. I've got a sneaking suspicion it's going back to Newcastle next year. But even though there was talk of it going to the Ricoh, yeah, absolutely, because you know that's the way you draw people in, isn't it? And again, it's back to our original part of the conversation when you're saying which is the best way, seeding and growing or implanting, and this is part of the double pincer movement, isn't it? That you have a club like Coventry who are there. But if you put these big events on, that's where the kids really want to go and have a look at the real sexy stuff that's being played by, you know, Australia, England or New Zealand, whoever it is. And that's where they fall in love with the spectacle. And then they start looking around and saying, well, what's available to us locally? And because there's a club like Coventry there, they can fall into that and get involved in that. So it's absolutely vital that there are events at places like the Ricoh. I'd love to see, in the early years of Super League, we had an on-the-road round where every club took a home match on the road. I'm not sure there was a game in Coventry. There was certainly a game in Northampton. I remember going to, is it the Sixfield Stadium at Northampton? So it would be great to replicate that, you know, to say, right, every club takes a game on the road. And if Castleford are involved in developing the game in the West Midlands or the East Midlands or wherever, they take a game to Coventry and say, you know, this is Super League. This is how it's played. This is how good it is, because it is great. If you've never seen a game, you know, if you see it for the first time up front, you realise how good a game it is, and that ignites interest. So yeah, absolutely, that would be smashing to see a lot more games being played in Coventry and places like that.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. If you can make that happen, then throw in some good words. So just to round off, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but
no, that's great.
Just wanted to look ahead to 2018, and specifically League One, and obviously we've got Bradford Bulls are going to be in League One in 2018, and there's talk of the second Canadian team due to be announced, probably not for 2018, but on the horizon. So looking at a League One as a journalist for 2018, are Bradford Bulls, are they the standout story, or are there other things that excite you about League One next year?
To be entirely honest with you, I'm not entirely sure, and don't quote me on this, but I'm not entirely sure that Bradford will be playing in League One next year. There's a real suspicion that they're going to be in the Championship, and I don't know how this is going to be manufactured, I don't know how this will come about. But I mean, if we take it on face value that they are in the Championship, then yeah, I think in the so-called heartlands, they'll be the story, because you know everybody knows the Bradford name and the fall from grace, and is this the beginning of them coming back to where a lot of people think they should be, but they've no right to just be given that. They've got to earn it again. So they will be a story. But I'm really intrigued by, what's happening at Coventry and what's happening at Newcastle and South Wales. South Wales is it's going to be a new club next year, isn't it? In a different part of the world, different parts of South Wales. So, and London Scullers as well. How those clubs develop. What happens from here? How do they make themselves valuable to the game? I think that's crucial. And to do that, I think they're going to have to, continue to build in terms of support, but continue to build more importantly in terms of developing young kids and developing those networks in the communities. So I think that's going to be intriguing. That's going to be intriguing. You look at the names geographically. League One is fantastic, and maybe should be getting a lot more coverage. But I think it's kind of a reflection of the coverage rugby league gets generally. That Super League struggles to get kind of national profiles. So League One is certainly going to struggle to get national profile. But within the game, I think people should be taking a little more notice of League One, and to have a Bradford in there. Just as there's been a Toronto. I think there's been more interest this year in League One than ever before because of that Toronto story. And people have been aware of what's been going on down there a little bit more. And that might happen again with Bradford this year and maybe Hamilton, the new Canadian team, if and when they come in the year after. So, I think the game as a whole should be taking a little more notice of what's happening in League One, good and bad. Making sure that it's that the game is being protected. As well as being promoted within that division.
Yeah, great stuff. Well, Dave, thank you so much for your time. And as I said earlier in the interview, if you do ever want to come down to Coventry next year, then you will be very welcome at the Butts Park Arena, and I'd be happy to introduce you to everyone down there and showcase what's going on at the club. I
will. You'll regret saying that because I will take you up on that offer, Dave. I will be down there. So I'd love to do that.
Excellent. Love to do that. Hopefully get to chat to you in person next season. Enjoy the grand final this weekend. Any tips for who you think is going to win, or are you going to remain impartial?
I don't know who's going to win. I think probably the game as a whole wants Castleford to win because the year they've had. But then again, the two greats leaving Leeds, Maguire and Burrow, and what kind of a fairy tale could they write? Leeds know their way around Old Trafford. Castleford, under the lights of that extreme pressure for the first time. So who knows what's going to happen, but just hopefully it's going to be a fantastic final.
Seconded here. Great stuff, Dave. Thanks ever so much again. Enjoy the grand final, enjoy the World Cup, and I'll see you at Coventry next year.
Thanks, Dave. See you soon.
Bare Necessities is a podcast about the Coventry Bears. It's an independent show, but it wouldn't be possible without the support and the encouragement of the club. So huge thanks to everyone at the Bears for helping us out. Come and say hi to us on Twitter, where we're at CovBearsPodcast. Tweet Craig your questions using #AskMrC and let us know if you want to have your roar heard. Don't forget to subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Stitcher or wherever else. And if you like the show, leave us a rating or review and spread the word to anyone else who loves the Bears. Bare Necessities is brought to you by me, Dave Musson, and Craig Cathcart, and our theme music is by my band Wave. See you next time.